Anbernic recently released their new Sega-inspired handheld emulator. And it sure does look nice, at least on the outside. But what about on the inside? Well, we're going to find out today when we tear this thing down and take a look at the design. If you were to look through my handheld emulator collection, you'd probably notice that I have a few different Anbernic devices. It's not that I think other brands aren't good. I've just been really impressed with Anbernic's quality overall. And their newer ARC device is no exception. Anbernic devices will usually run one of two operating systems, either Android or some variant of Linux. And while the ARC Model S only runs Linux, the ARC Model D can actually boot up in either Android 11 or Linux, and this makes it a pretty versatile device. To make using Android on the ARC somewhat bearable, the Model D includes a touchscreen. Of course, it's possible to use Android without one, but there are some aspects of Android that are just more difficult to navigate with buttons alone. You can use emulators in Android, but where it really shines is playing native Android games with controller support. Games like Castlevania and Wonder Boy 3 offer up a great experience. Installing those games is rather difficult though. After fiddling with it for a couple of hours, I wasn't able to get the Google Play Store running. I ended up installing Gamma OS, which is a custom Android 12 firmware with the Play Store built in. Only after I did that was I able to install and run some Android games. If you don't want to go through the trouble of messing with Android and instead want a more tightly integrated experience, you can boot up Linux with an emulation station interface from the microSD card. For most emulators, Linux is going to perform better than Android anyway. If you're primarily playing classic retro games, then you're likely going to spend all of your time in Linux. I'm not really going to spend much time reviewing the exterior of the ARC, but I will say I really dig the Sega vibe. The Sega Genesis was my console of choice as a teenager, and I really loved those controllers.
Combat, the arcade edition, and the all-new Shinobi 3, and Marvel's X-Men. Now things are pretty much okay.
And as you can see, this device is heavily inspired by the 6-button Sega controller. And I have to say, the curvature of the device, coupled with the placement of the buttons, make it a real joy to hold in your hands. And speaking of those buttons, oh my, they are wonderful to press. The D-pad in particular rolls under your thumb very smoothly and has a satisfying tactile rubber dome that doesn't feel too squishy. It's clear that this D-pad is really going to shine in games of that Street Fighter II type of genre. Alright, let's get it open and see what's inside. First, we'll need to remove the 8 screws around the perimeter of the shell. And the enclosure is snapped together, so some gentle prying should pop it open. The first thing that I noticed here is the battery wrapped in a zebra-striped packaging. This is a standard LiPo battery with a capacity of 3,500 milliamp hours. And Anbernic claims that you'll get 6 hours of playtime on this battery, and that's certainly reasonable given its size against the hardware specs of the device. After removing the battery, you'll notice the series of passives here that are clumped together. So the CPU is probably under this spot on the other side of the board. But there's actually a nice plastic bracket here that holds the battery in place. I don't think we'll need to remove that to get to anything, so I'll just leave it alone. The other thing that stands out here is the 2 shoulder buttons. We'll need to unscrew those to get a better look. First, you'll notice that both buttons are rubber domes, which is great to see. I usually see tack switches for shoulder buttons on most of these handheld devices, but I think the rubber domes just feel so much better. But there's another interesting thing about these shoulder buttons. Notice the connector that they're plugged into. The connector on the right side is 180 degrees rotated when compared to the connector on the left side. This enables Anbernic to use the same shoulder button assembly for both sets of buttons, and this saves on manufacturing costs and also helps make repairs and replacements easier. And we can't ignore the chip right here with the metal shield and the antenna wire next to it. So this will be the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth module. Now, unfortunately, the shield is soldered in place, so I can't get to the chip without removing it. And honestly, it seems like it's a lot more trouble than it's worth. I will say the Wi-Fi performance on my device has been absolutely terrible. In fact, this is my #1 complaint about the ARC-D. Wi-Fi seems to drop every few minutes, even though I have a very solid wireless network in my home. And when it's your main source of updates, box art, and retro achievements, that really puts a damper on the experience. To be fair, this could just be my specific unit. Now, I've done a little research, and I haven't really seen anyone else with the same complaint. Okay, well, let's remove the mainboard and see what's underneath. We'll first need to remove a few more screws and disconnect the LCD ribbon cable. Before we take a closer look at the board, let's first see what's on the front half of the device. It's no surprise here that we have rubber dome button pads for the 6 buttons, as well as the directional pad. They are a bit rigid, but personally I prefer that to buttons that feel too mushy. The start and select buttons are also rubber domes, which isn't something that you see too often. But not everything is a rubber dome. There are actually a few tack switches along the top side of the board for the power, function, and volume buttons. Also in the front half of the shell, we have 2 vibration motors, both with spring connectors instead of wires, and 2 speakers, also with spring connectors. Using spring tension contacts instead of wires here certainly makes disassembly and repair easier. But it also limits what parts you can use because they're less common than the standard variety with wires that you would solder. There's also a flex cable with a chip on it, which is connected to the screen. The chip here says Goodix GT927. Now, Goodix is primarily known for making sensors, and so this chip right here is actually the touchscreen sensor controller. This chip reads the capacitive touch data from the screen and then uses I2C to send it over to the CPU. And interestingly enough, you'll notice that there's not only I2C pinout markings on the ribbon cable, but it also says RG405M. That's actually a different Android-based handheld device that Anbernic makes, which also has a 4-inch touchscreen. So it looks like Anbernic is using up their supply of LCDs left over from that device. Speaking of which, this LCD seems to be about par for the course with these handheld gaming devices. It has a 640 by 480 resolution, and that gives it a 4:3 aspect ratio. It measures 4 inches on the diagonal, and I definitely appreciate that it's on the larger side. But with a 3.2 inch by 2.4 inch display, this leaves us with a pixel density of 200 pixels per inch, which isn't bad, but it's not going to be as good as the display on your cell phone. Okay, let's now take another look at the main board and see what kind of chips we have. The main one to look at here is the processor, and that's this large chip right here, a Rockchip RK3566. Anbernic is no stranger to Rockchip ICs. In fact, they use Rockchip processors in some of their other devices, such as the RG351M and 353M, as well as the RG503. The RK3566 here is a 64-bit SoC that's based on a quad-core ARM Cortex A55 CPU, and it runs at 1.8 GHz. Now, I've talked about SoCs on this channel before in other videos, but in case you're not familiar with the term, an SoC is basically a single chip that has multiple chips packaged into it. The ARC-3566 is not only the main CPU, but also plays the role of the video processor and USB host controller, among others. This chip was released in 2020, so it's been around for a couple of years. But interestingly enough, the ARC-3566 wasn't necessarily designed for mobile gaming devices. This diagram is from Rockchip's processor roadmap back in 2020. The x-axis in this chart represents a timeline, and the y-axis depicts processor performance. If you look on the right side in the year 2020, you'll see the ARC-3566 listed, and it's in the mid to upper range of the performance spectrum, which is good to see. But notice the blue eye next to the processor. Looking at the key, you'll see that this means the market scenario for this chip is actually IoT, or Internet of Things. And something that's even more interesting is that this SoC contains an NPU. What's an NPU? Well, it stands for Neural Processing Unit, and it's basically a chip that's optimized for AI-related tasks. It's quite common to see NPUs used in mobile SoCs these days. In fact, there's a good likelihood that you have one in your pocket right now. It's a great thing for smartphones because these processors are more efficient than the CPU at AI-related tasks that your phone might be doing, things such as touching up photos that you take with the phone's camera. But I just thought it was interesting that Rockchip included it in the 3566, as well as a couple of their other processors. I wouldn't think it's being used by any of the software running on the ARC, but it's not inconceivable that it could be, especially since the Model D does boot into Android and could technically run AI-enhanced Android apps. Also on the board, we have a chip from SK Hynix. This is 2 GB of LPDDR, or low power double data rate memory. Now keep in mind that I have the D model, which is why you see the 2 GB version here. But if you have an S model ARC, then your memory chip will only be 1 GB. This chip is a 200 ball BGA chip, which stands for ball grid array. This means that instead of having legs that you would solder to the board, there's a grid of solder balls underneath the chip that you would melt with an oven or hot air. And this also means that it's a lot more difficult to replace or upgrade this chip. Now, I've done BGA replacements and reflows in the past, but I'm definitely not great at it, and it's not something that I really enjoy doing, so I try to avoid it if I can. So if you want to buy the S model and then upgrade the RAM to save a couple of dollars, I'd recommend against it. Next to the memory chip, we have a chip labeled SEC849. This is the Embedded Multimedia Card, or eMMC, storage chip, which adds 32 GB of flash storage. You're only going to see this chip on the ARC Model D, because this is where the Android operating system files are stored. Like the RAM chip, this eMMC chip is also in a BGA package. So while you could technically upgrade it to a 64 GB chip, doing so would be a bit challenging. We also have another IC from Rockchip here. It's the RK817-5. This is primarily a power management chip, but there are also a couple of other things that it can do. First, as a power management chip, it's used to charge the battery and provide power path management. And it's also the chip that manages the power for the OTG, or on-the-go port. Anbernic likes to include these ports, and they're really handy. It essentially allows the device to act as a USB host. So you can do things like mount a USB drive, or even a USB gamepad. But one feature that I don't think a lot of people are aware of is that the RK817 allows the ARC to also function as a portable battery charger. You can plug your phone or other device into the OTG port, and the Anbernic ARC will charge it up for you. Also, interestingly enough, this RK817 also has a Class D stereo amplifier built in, as well as a headphone driver, but I'm not sure that the ARC is using that functionality. And the reason I say this is because of this other chip here. This chip, labeled SGM4865, is a separate stereo amplifier designed to drive a set of 4 ohm speakers. Okay, the last chip I'll mention here is the CW2015. This is a battery fuel gauge. Basically, it reports the state of the battery to the CPU over I²C. Now, that RK817 chip that I talked about a few minutes ago also has a battery fuel gauge built in, but I'm assuming that Anbernic isn't using that feature since they included this dedicated chip instead. I'm not sure why exactly, but it does look like the CW2015 will be more accurate since there's a 14-bit ADC versus the 12-bit that's in the RK817. Alright, before I put this device back together and give you my final thoughts, I want to call out this guy right here. This is a microphone. Yeah, this device has a hidden mic that not only isn't called out in any of Anbernic's documentation, but there are also no markings or other indicators on the case that let you know that it's there. When the unit's closed up, it sits discreetly next to the select button, and despite there not being a hole in the case, it can pick up your voice just fine. This is a test of the hidden microphone on the Anbernic ARC. Despite there not being any hole in the case, it can still pick up your voice pretty good.
This is a test of the hidden microphone on the Anbernic ARC. Despite there not being any hole in the case, it can still pick up your voice pretty good.
Now, I'm not saying that there's anything malicious going on here. I just think it's a bit odd that it's in there and it's not mentioned anywhere. I have to say that overall, I do like the Anbernic ARC. But aside from the aesthetics and the feel of the buttons, it doesn't really seem too different than some of Anbernic's other devices. Plus, with the Wi-Fi performing so poorly, coupled with the fact that there aren't many options for an aftermarket firmware, it's probably not going to get much use from me. But if you decide to pick one of these up, I'd suggest just going with the ARC Model S, unless you have a reason for running Android. Yeah, there's more memory on the Model D, but without analog sticks, you're probably not going to be playing systems that will take advantage of that additional memory anyway. Well, if you enjoyed this teardown and want to see more of this type of thing, give this video a like and let me know in the comments below. I have a ton of different devices that I would love to dig into and give you an analysis on if it's something that you guys would want to watch. Alright, that about does it for this video. I hope you found it entertaining and enjoyable. If you liked it, consider subscribing and maybe stick around and check out a couple of my other videos. Alright, well, I'll see you next time. But, as always, until then, go make something cool.